Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming this afternoon. A couple weeks ago, I received an email from a publicist who was promoting the release of the next Planet of the Apes movie. It's coming out next year. And I secretly didn't really care about the movie, but it did get me to thinking about when Earth really was the planet of the apes. And this is during the Miocene epoch, between 22 million and 5 million years ago. And there were as many as 100 ape species roaming throughout the old world. So wouldn't we all just love to hop in a time machine and go back then and see all those wonderful creatures? So most of these guys obviously died out, and the reason for that was severe climate change at the end of the Miocene. So we don't really have to shoulder the blame for that loss. But there's no question that human activity is pushing the few remaining ape species to the brink. One of the greatest threats that we've introduced to them is that of disease, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We're physiologically, as you all know, very similar to our ape cousins, so it makes sense that apes are susceptible to many of the same diseases that ail us. But they're also, in some ways, more vulnerable to these diseases than we are. And the reason for that is that humans have supercharged immune systems. It's one of the reasons why we have longer lifespans than other primates. And there's several reasons for this. One is that it seems to be that we evolved some superior immune genes to kind of adapt us to meat eating. So our ancient ancestors, like the Australopithecines, those guys were mostly vegetarian, and at some point around the time of maybe 2 million years ago with Homo erectus, our ancestors started eating a lot more meat, and that exposed them to many more pathogens. And so the sort of stage was set for us to evolve these adaptations to these new pathogens, our ancestors anyway. And we also may have picked up some beneficial variants of immune genes when early Homo sapiens interbred with our archaic humans like Neanderthals. This is what some of the new genetic research is showing with the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome and other archaic hominins. And the other sort of thing that goosed our immune system is that, of course, 10,000 years ago with the dawn of agriculture, you get humans living in far greater concentrations. So you're exposed to more pathogens, and you have to kind of adapt to that or die. So this immune superiority of ours, if you will, combined with slight differences in our physiology, means that certain pathogens are little more than an irritation to us, like the head cold I seem to have contracted on the way over here, can be really dangerous for apes. And by the same token, even though we have these supercharged immune systems, the threat of disease transmission between apes and humans, it cuts both ways. Apes can transmit diseases to us. HIV, Ebola, monkeypox, these are all diseases that jumped from non-human primates to us. So the problem boils down to this. Scientists, tourists, and local communities are exposing apes to deadly pathogens. And meanwhile, bushmeat hunters are exposing themselves to pathogens from apes. And the hunters can then spread these pathogens to other people they come into contact with. And so the questions that I want to put to our speakers and to those of you in the audience are, can we study and observe these fascinating animals without, in effect, loving them to death? Does improving the welfare of local communities reduce the risk of disease transmission to apes? And is the threat of disease transmission actually an education opportunity? Could educating locals about these risks reduce hunting of these animals? Without further ado, we'll turn to our speakers. And first, we're going to have Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka of the Conservation Through Public Health talk to us. Gladys is founder and chief executive officer of Conservation Through Public Health, a grassroots nonprofit organization based in Uganda in conjunction with the U.S. office at Colgate, the School of Environmental Studies there. And Gladys promotes conservation and public health by improving primary health care to both people and animals in and around protected areas in Africa with a vision to controlling disease transmission.
I'm basically going to talk about some of the things that Kate has brought up, primarily focusing on local community and wildlife interface in Uganda. I'm going to mainly talk about the work that we're doing in Burundi today. The reason why we felt that we needed to start focusing on people is because a lot of our conservation areas in Africa and around the world don't have much chance of surviving when there's such a high human population growth. And in Burundi, there's a very hard edge. When it was created as a national park in 1992, people were told to stop cutting trees, and there isn't much of a buffer zone. The same thing happens in the other gorilla populations in Rwanda and Congo and the rest in Uganda. Some of the highest population growths are right around the national parks. It's actually much worse in the Virunga National Park. It can go up to 600 people per square kilometer. And so, in other words, it's very hard to protect the gorillas and the wildlife without thinking about the people whose needs are so dependent on the forest, and yet the forest also needs to survive. One of the first cases I had to deal with when I was a vet for Uganda Wildlife Authority, we had a scabies outbreak in the mountain gorillas. And it was quite a surprising disease because it's not commonly studied and people don't think about it much, but it's a disease of poor hygiene. And when we went to the group, actually I was with Dr. Liz McPhee, she was heading IGCP at the time, we found that the infant had lost almost all its hair and was crying, and all the others were very sick. We treated them with ivermectin. The infant didn't survive. And when samples were taken, they found that they were the same genetic material as the people living around the park. And actually, it turned out that scabies is actually quite common in the local communities. And because it's a disease of poor hygiene and sanitation, it's preventable, highly preventable, but because these people lack information on disease issues, and these people live very far from water sources, clean water sources, they rarely bathe. In fact, in some places, they bathe once a week when they're going to church on Sunday. So it was something that we really needed to look at. And of course, you may ask yourself, where did they get the scabies from? This time around, when we're looking more at the local community, they probably got it when they went into people's gardens to raid crops. The gorillas love eating the banana plants over here, matoke. And this particular photograph was taken in a garden of a farmer whose children are employed by the park. And when I actually asked him if he thinks gorillas are important, he said, yes, my children are employed by the park, but the individual farmer like me whose crop is destroyed, I don't get compensated. Even up to now, compensation is a topic which the community still wants. This week, I attended a workshop for the Poverty and Conservation Learning Group in Kampala, and they were disseminating results of the findings, and people are still talking about compensation 20 years after Burundi has become a national park. So this led us to set up conservation through public health. CTPH basically works at the interface of conservation and public health. We promote biodiversity conservation by enabling people, wildlife, and livestock to coexist through improving their primary health care. And more recently, we've also started to look at livelihoods because we found that many people are unhealthy because they're poor. And you can't really, the two are very closely linked to each other. And our vision is for people, wildlife, and livestock to live in balanced health and harmony with local communities acting as stewards of their environment. So CTPH has three main programs: wildlife health, which is really a bigger part of wildlife conservation, a smaller part, community health, and then livelihoods. And the livelihoods, we started with telecenters. My husband's also a founder member of CTPH and is a specialist in telecom, and we brought telecenters to Burundi and Queen Elizabeth National Park, which actually was highly embraced by the youth in the community. But I'll mainly talk about the wildlife health and the community health work. And with the wildlife health work, having worked in UA for Uganda Wildlife Authority before starting CTPH, I realized the importance of setting up programs that are not parallel to the national park structure. So from the very beginning, we felt that the gorilla health had to be the primary responsibility of the rangers. So we introduced something new, which was regular fecal collection from mountain gorillas, instead of waiting only until they're sick and have scabies, and then you're wondering, where did it come from? We wanted to be more proactive. So over here, we trained the rangers to collect dung which they collect often. And then at the same time, we continue to look at zoonotic disease investigations. Over there's one of our lab technicians, Stephen Rubanga, who's also a founder member, and he was looking under the microscope. But on the next to him over here is anthrax under the microscope. We've had anthrax outbreaks in Queen Elizabeth National Park, which is not too far from Bwindi. And it's been in hippos, and people have eaten the hippos. A few of them have died, and many of them have got sick. So there has been anthrax in Ivory Coast, I believe, the chimps in the Thai forest. So it's a threat even to great apes. We had the US ambassador coming to the Gorilla Research Clinic that we set up in Bwindi through a partnership with UA. And they really enjoyed looking down the microscope because that time USAID was giving us funding through African Wildlife Foundation. We also look at disease in livestock because we found that gorillas are also exposed to disease from livestock and not only from humans. And with the community health program, a lot of it is education and behavior change communication, where we do it through drama groups. And we work closely with traditional healers because we find that they're the first people that they go to, the community goes to, and they're the most accessible. We set up a PHE flip chart where we started looking at family planning, because when you have so many children, you can't give them enough health care, and they end up getting infectious diseases that can then also make the gorillas sick. We work with village health and conservation teams. Village health teams are a recognized structure in the Ministry of Health, and we also get them to do conservation work. Over there's Lynn Gaffikin, who's here today. She's part of helping us to form those. We look at water conservation and sanitation. And these volunteers give injections, and we have to sustain them. We've given them bicycles and cupboards, and also goats, which they've reinvested into village saving and loan associations. Some of our results is that we have about 120 volunteers in Bwindi and Virungas, and they've managed to reach as many as 22,000 people. And we've had increased reporting of human and gorilla interactions and increased monitoring at the interface. Some of the impact is that we've had a 12-fold increase in new family planning users. The women have really embraced this. And we've had a 50% increase in hand washing facilities, an 11-fold increase in people suspected for TB being referred. On the conservation side, we've had reduced human and gorilla conflicts, reduced disease incidence in the gorillas, and improved perceived conservation attitudes. We're trying to build a bigger center in partnership with UA in order to be able to do many more tests. And we're carrying out a lot of advocacy. And some of the future directions are that we want to link the health interventions more to conservation. And you talked about bushmeat. Actually, the recent findings are that the biggest illegal access to the forest has been through bushmeat.
We're going to hear more from you when we get to the discussion part. We're going to turn it over now to Tony Mudakikwa of the Rwandan Development Agency. Tony is the head of the veterinary unit, research and monitoring of the Rwanda Development Board of Tourism and Conservation. Over the past 18 years, he's been working on furthering the conservation and health of the country's endangered mountain gorillas. The scope of his work has seen him working in all of Rwanda's national parks. So, Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer to give us this honor to share with our colleague what we have been doing. It's a very good way, I think, to create network and really to feel that we are working all of us for the same goal. So most of the people here know Uganda, DR Congo, because those are very huge country known for their, wealth. But I put this big map here because I challenge a few of you to recognize where's Rwanda here. And Rwanda is there here. That's there. It's a tiny country, but very, very big in terms of conservation because of the mountain gorilla. And Rwanda, we managed to have 3 protected areas. In the north, we have the Volcano National Park, which is a part of the Virunga Massif. In the southeast, in my southeast part is you have the Nyungwe forest, and the Nyungwe forest with the chimpanzees, and in the eastern part we have the Akagera, which is a savanna-type park. One thing that we have in Rwanda, it's the focus of looking and trying the best trackers that can be very good guide who could recognize individual gorilla in each group, so that if there is any transfer, if there is any interaction with a group, for example, in Uganda, or a new group from Uganda, we can detect them. And it's one of the requirements to be accepted as a guide. Here, for example, I want to show you the group that we have as a research group. Most of you recognize probably Pablo, Titus, and eventually Uganda. But now, because of the interaction, because of the splitting, we have about 9 group of research group, known individually and monitor every day. Those are the tourist group, people who used to work in Rwanda, some of them here can recognize eventually Sabinho, Sousa, but we have now more than, as you can see, 9. And the number that we have in your right, it's the number of composition. The importance of knowing individual is crucial for people who are doing health monitoring, because if there is an outbreak, which was the case, for example, in Uganda during the second outbreak, after the outbreak that Gladys was talking about, and we were in charge of this the treatment, and it became very difficult because it was a new group, and it was difficult to know and to track individuals that were being treated, for which we gave treatment. So it's from that time that we found that it was very important for the trackers and guide to insist on the recognition and the identification of each individual. This is an example of the range of group by year, but we have daily monitoring, and every month we have a report on a ranging of each gorilla, and we can also map the range of each year. This is from 2012, and this is another 2010. Here, we also do the monitoring of death and birth. This is an example of the monitoring of 2 different years on death and new birth. Those are the names of infant and mother, the mother and the date of birth. Those are for 2013, 2012. Here we have a death and some preliminary necropsy results of the cause. We have a very good relationship with the UC Davis in California, and that's where we are doing and running our pathology sample. Recently, some of you probably learn about the fact that we discover one of the virus who's known on human, the human metapneumovirus that was found in one of the deaths of gorillas. So it's very important to understand that the monitoring system, the health monitoring, it's really important because that's how we came to document and scientifically establish the cause of death. We have also a health monitoring system, which is called IMPACT, which were established from a very large work of many people, including people like Dominic Travis and Christine and other people, where we start looking for a more effective way and more consistent way of reporting. This came because of a problem we had over the year where we used to have a lot of vet, but each vet was coming with a different way of reporting. So we sat together with a multidisciplinary group, and we set a way of reporting, and this is a system that I've been using for years. And this impact system has been digitalized, and with that we can as well, exchange with some of our colleagues who are, overseas, like in the US, to get some information. And the 3 level explain the 3 type of intervention. The first level is on the local, the second is on the more advanced, and the third is more on the international level, where we can call for international expert and other institution. That's an example of intervention. For those who are not aware, before intervening on the gorillas, there is some requirement. We set some rules. We don't intervene for any case. We only intervene when it's a life-threatening or if it's from the human origin. I didn't talk about this, but I think probably Dominic will talk about. We also develop what we call a veterinary contingency plan to minimize adverse effect of disease introduction into mountain gorilla population. And this was established in 2003, but now we are in the process of to revisiting this and update it. Thank you.
Next up is Dominic Travis. He's associate professor at the University of Minnesota. He's a veterinary epidemiologist and professor of ecosystem health at the university. Previously, he was vice president of conservation and science at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. And for the past 13 years, he's worked on health issues of non-human primates in North American and European zoos, sanctuaries, and managed populations in Asia and Africa, among other places. He's a member of both the Conservation Breeding Specialists Group and Veterinary Specialist Group of the IUCN, and he's a scientific advisor to the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project and co-founder of the Ecosystem Health Project in Gombe National Park in Tanzania. So,
I think we have 2 wonderful examples, 2 case studies that we just heard of part of the solution, and I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the problem and the evolution of the discussion of the problem. And then they gave some of the answers to that, which is I realize a part of why we're here. So I had the opportunity in the last week to poll a number of the leading health kind of research people that we as a community work with, knowing that some people would have their own things and opportunities to say here. And I want to give them a little bit of credit. It includes Kirsten Gilardi and Mike Cranfield from Gorilla Doctors. Sorry, Kirsten, I got the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project thing wrong. From UC Davis, Lynn Gaffigan, who's here from Stanford, Fabian Leandertz from Robert Koch, Felicia Nutter and Chris Whittier from Tufts, Innocent Ruego, Lawrence Magisha from Academy University, Lisa Jones-Engel from University of Washington, Elizabeth Lonsdorf, Tom Gillespie from Emory, and then Beatrice Hahn. Some of those names will sound familiar to you if you've studied or looked at publications or collaborated with people on health. So I read them to show a smattering of this, and we came up through a conversation of kind of 5 points we thought people should hear. Some of them may be obvious, but since this will be broadcast in a broader venue, then maybe they'll still be relevant. So our top 5 list of things you should hear. And the first and foremost is if you think about the last 20 years, we started with a number of case studies, people who had experience in the field who saw disease, people who thought it was a concern, but it was more the one-off case study or case series kind of outlook of things. And then we had the Holmesy report, which a number of you here were responsible for, that talked about the potential risk of disease to health and longevity and sustainability of great ape populations. So 15 years or 20 years later almost, one point we want to make is it is no longer disputable that the health of non-human primates is inextricably linked with local and faraway tourist humans and their domesticated animals. So there's been a debate and a lot of conversation about does disease matter? And we can pull up the case studies. And I think we collectively would like to say, let's get beyond that. We've done the correlation, now let's talk more about the causation. And we've made some interesting inroads into that in the last few years, as you see more studies that have actually shown and been able to link through the molecular diagnostic tools, the different bugs that are being found in domestic animals, humans, and great apes or non-human primates in general. We obviously have many examples, like you said, of diseases going different directions and emerging from different populations. As an epidemiologist, this just says it's an ecosystem and we share it. And when you think health, you have to think about the ecosystem. So at the risk of alienating people who have focused their entire life on very specific species in very specific places, we have to drag our focus out of that and think much more bigger, much larger and much more holistically. So again, let's move from correlation to causation. Let's accept the fact that health matters and end the debate. If you look at population sustainability modeling, risk of extinction, and you look at the fact that small populations are highly affected, obviously, potentially by catastrophic events, and disease or health can be a catastrophic event, we should be able to move forward from there. So what are we going to do about it? And in the last 15 or so years, I've been embroiled in a number of debates that have resulted in analysis paralysis. And for those of you who aren't in our culture and don't hear that as much, you analyze so much that you can do nothing. And so the goal of this part 2 here is getting us beyond analysis paralysis into doing something. And many people, many places have. We just heard 2 wonderful examples. But I think there needs to be a real choice and a real conversation about management. And I know there are a lot of those conversations going on right now, and we could have conversations about are there any truly wild populations and all of those wonderful philosophical things. But now I'm talking about health management specifically, because you really have 2 choices immunologically when you talk about these, right? You can create a bubble and try and live within it, or you can run the gauntlet and the survivors are strong. And both of those are very difficult, and neither one of those are wonderful choices. So what kind of hybrid approach can we take to assess the risk and kind of manage based upon that? So when you choose to create a management bubble, you need intensive data and intensive modeling and intensive work in order to maintain the kind of control to keep safe, right? And so this is from, if you, in this room, the ape-centric perspective, right? If you're going to create that bubble, how are you going to do that? The surveillance and monitoring, the intense surveillance and monitoring that we're seeing here. You need available diagnostic tools, which we don't in general have. You have to have the discussion of invasive sample collection, which I'm not going to start necessarily here. But the point is you can only do so much with fecal samples and other kinds of swabs and hair and things if you really want those answers. And if you really want those answers quickly enough to be able to manage them. So on the flip side, the running the gauntlet involves a lot of uncertainty, right? You're doing less protective and preventive measures. You're allowing things to come in and potentially go through the population. It may have a huge impact on that population. It's very uncertain. Not many may survive, but those who do survive may be immunologically more strong. Very interesting correlative result from Gombe National Park, where you look at Fifi, who's was one of the oldest chimps and certainly one of Jane's oldest friends. Her core area was closest to people. She had the most lifetime cumulative exposure to people, probably out of any of the chimps that we analyzed in the history of Gombe, and she had an incredibly strong immune system and obviously outlived, and her fecundity was incredibly high. So in terms of a case study kind of thing, maybe her exposure of running the gauntlet made her stronger, and then hence that family lived and has thrived. So there's different kinds of conversations, and we need to have those conversations, and we need to make choices. Again, so point 3 comes back to that analysis paralysis. If we don't make that choice, we won't have infrastructure, we won't have agreements, and we won't be prepared to do something when something does happen, or we won't be prepared to understand the implications of our decisions, which will lead to more disagreement and things. So the last two points are really, it's it's more than the apes. I'm sorry to say that. But when you talk about health, I've made that point, you need to think about the interaction with local people. Wonderful example. CTPH is the example of how to think about that. And by the way, health is a wonderful way to build a relationship with a local community. Talking about health versus don't go take that tree for firewood or do whatever else. It needs to be multidisciplinary, holistic. We've heard that a lot today. Partnerships. But we don't know how to play together yet in general. So we need some real effort at learning to play together. And that includes team building, it includes shared leadership and things like that. There are a lot of active programs going on where we need to learn to create these big One Health or holistic teams. We're just not good at that yet, even though we want to do it, most of us. And then monkeys. Ape people, please don't forget about the monkeys. When you think about health, we could probably name a lot more risk from the local monkey populations in a lot of ways than the human populations, or think about them as the conduit between the populations. So modeling baboons, modeling other monkeys as you go. And we've actually started into bush pigs and cryptosporidium and all sorts of other things in Galway. And finally, the obvious thing for sustainability of these programs, these are not quick scientific projects that you get the answer, you get your PhD, and you move out. These are long-term monitoring projects. People who do behavioral science should be used to that discussion as well. Health is the same. How do we do the funding to keep these sustainable projects going when we do that? Arcus Foundation, thank you. You've paid for most of the ape health research that has gone on, I think, in the community for a while. We need more. So we need a plan and a strategy for that. Thank you.
So next is Josephine Head. She's a conservation biologist at Max Planck Institute. She's currently working as a consultant for the Arcus Foundation, and she studies the bushmeat issue as it relates to apes in Africa and Asia. She's previously worked in Gabon for 7 years, studying chimps and western gorillas, and forest elephants in their feeding ecology. So let's hear what you have to say.
Gladys and Tony talked more about the risks humans pose to apes, and what I'm going to be talking more about is the kind of flip side of that, and looking at the risk that apes can pose to humans and how perhaps that could be used in a sort of positive way to reduce bushmeat hunting. So as most of you, I'm sure, know, bushmeat hunting is the consumption of wild animals for food, and it's practiced worldwide. And bushmeat can range from birds and rats and squirrels to duikers and monkeys and bush pig, and despite there being some localized taboos in some areas, it does also include all great apes across their range. And bushmeat consumption can either be subsistence, which generally means it's consumed by the hunter and their families, and in many rural areas it's a staple part of the diet and can form up to 80% of dietary protein in some households. On the other side, you've got commercial hunting, which involves the sale of bushmeat for monetary gain, and usually involves the transport of the bushmeat to nearby towns and cities or further afield, even internationally. And depending on what sort of level of the chain you're at, it can be very lucrative. And whilst bushmeat hunting has gone on for many, many thousands of years, recently there's been a big increase in the intensity and spatial extent of the bushmeat trade, and this has resulted in much greater contact between humans and animals than perhaps there was in the past. To give an example, in the Congo Basin, it's estimated that between 1 and 3 million tons of bushmeat is extracted on an annual basis. And factors behind this increasing threat include commercial logging, extractive industry, what we've heard about earlier today, in addition to growing human populations, and in some areas also the disruption of local trading due to armed conflict, which can increase people's reliance on bushmeat. So all of these factors essentially mean that even the most remote forests have become accessible to hunters, and as I said, there's much greater contact. And while some animal species are robust and kind of respond much better to hunting pressures, apes in particular are very sensitive. They're very slow growing and have long birth intervals. So even low levels of hunting can be catastrophic, and hunting poses a huge threat to their continued survival. To put bushmeat hunting in the international context, over the last sort of 50 years or more, there's been a big increase in global human migration, and this has resulted in increased shipments of bushmeat being transported internationally, in particular to places like the US, Europe, and China. And to give an example, a study in Paris that was just working in one airport estimated that 270 tons of bushmeat were passing through that airport on an annual basis. And another study in London was estimating that up to 10 tons were being sold across the capital in markets every single day. And whilst it's very difficult to kind of estimate the value of the international trade because of the illicit nature, it has been estimated to be worth more than $1 billion annually. So there's really, a lot of money involved. To put bushmeat in the context of this panel, so it's thought that 75% of human emerging diseases are zoonotic in origin. So bushmeat hunting is not only a threat to ape conservation, it's also a serious human health issue, both locally and internationally. As has already been discussed, contact with blood and fluids of apes during the butchering process is a proven route of disease transmission to humans. And these diseases include things such as Ebola, HIV, simian foamy-virus, in addition to others. And HIV in particular has killed 30 million people worldwide and infected another 34 million, while the Ebola virus, there have been more than 20 outbreaks in the last 35 years across Africa, resulting in more than 1,500 fatalities. And then on the flip side, in terms of Ebola, the mortality rate among apes is similarly high or thought to be perhaps even higher. One example is in the Lossi Reserve in Republic of Congo, when Ebola swept through there, 90% of the gorillas were thought to be wiped out, whilst a recent review estimated that 30% of the global gorilla population may already have been wiped out by Ebola epidemics. And one important thing is that this disease risk isn't just restricted to localized individuals, people, sort of on the front line hunting and butchering these animals. Because of the international trade, then this threat goes worldwide. The study in Paris found that 25% of the bushmeat coming through had already been butchered but was still raw, whilst a further 21% was raw and hadn't even been butchered. So nearly 50% of all the meat coming through was posing a serious, or potentially posed a serious risk to health, human health. And then just to summarize, in the context of the discussion, how can we protect great apes and ourselves going forward? I think I'd summarize my viewpoint as follows. So our close relationship with apes means that there's an increased risk of transmission compared to other species that are regularly hunted for meat. And so I think developing behavior change strategies which specifically discourage hunting and consumption of apes can have the twofold benefit of firstly reducing the risk of disease transmission to humans, whilst obviously aiding ape conservation as well. And there have been many approaches to tackling the bushmeat issue with sort of behavior change, which include things like conservation education and law enforcement, integrated conservation and development initiatives, and tourism. And all of these things have had a localized positive impact in certain areas, but I think none of them so far have had a really widespread impact, probably because it's such a complex web of factors that influences bushmeat consumption in different areas. And some alternative approaches, which are things that I'm currently looking at with the work I'm doing on bushmeat, I feel that perhaps they haven't really been trialed yet in ape conservation, and some of them haven't really even been used in conservation yet, but I think there could be definite potential there, and perhaps these things we'll talk about in the discussion, but some is, public health education campaigns. Whilst to date they've sort of been, trying to get people to change their behaviour to prevent transmission to apes, perhaps, looking on the opposite side and trying to educate people about the disease risk from apes to them might be an approach. Other things include things like social marketing campaigns, entertainment education, which is something that's just in the sort of infancy of being used in ape conservation, and payments for environmental services, which I don't think have been used yet in ape conservation, but have proved successful in other conservation work with other species. So I think perhaps some of these alternative approaches used in conjunction with more traditional methods could be have great potential for protecting both the apes and ourselves in the future.
So we're now in the discussion part of this, and there's so much expertise in this room that I really hope you all will take advantage of this opportunity to, kind of engage with your peers on the stage, and for you guys to kind of even just ask your own questions of the audience. I'll be asking my own questions too. So at this point, does anybody have a question?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm interested to get the panel's take, especially given the audience here, on the risk posed by the reintroduction of primates from sanctuaries, particularly apes, but also, as Dominic said, the disease risk posed by introduced monkeys. There have now been several documented cases of reintroduced animals transmitting pathogens to wild populations. So I'd just like to hear the primate side of it in addition to the human side of it.
Can you just tell us your name and where you're from?
Yeah. Okay. Rich Burgill, North Carolina Zoo.
Great, thank you.
There is an entire discipline of human medicine on immigrant health. And it's there for a reason, because there are a lot of risks with humans, and since we're talking about the closest cousins, for isolating populations, moving populations, and mixing populations. To me, there is absolutely no difference in the discussion between the reintroduction of non-human primates and the movement of humans. There's obviously many pieces of that discussion that are different, but philosophically, mechanistically, I don't think there's much of a difference. So I think there's significant risk. I think measuring that is very difficult, but I think it can be done, and I know Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance, for instance, has been very proactive, trying to set up some protocols for that and things, so I credit the community. Just a reminder, there are IUCN reintroduction protocols, and they have health perspectives in them as well.
Does it change your funding opportunities if you kind of try to erase that divide between looking at disease, spread of disease from migrating humans versus what's coming out of animal populations? Does it benefit you actually to frame it the way you just said it?
So I came from a place where we brought in a lot of human health money by talking about this. We have Conservation Through Public Health, who is a lot of human money for talking about this kind of thing. And I think for research dollars, it depends on your question. Do you have a good question? Do you have a good hypothesis? Can you answer it?
Right.
For foundations and for getting into the human health or human funding arenas, then yeah, it has been somewhat successful, I think. I don't know, Gladys would be.
Yeah, I think with you find that when you go to human health donors, they don't want to know that animals are important, and they're only important if they're not posing a risk to humans. So you always have to change what you say slightly when you go, but it's surprisingly we've got funding from areas that you wouldn't expect, which are out with disease, like from family planning donors, because there's a big move for family planning, and they find that if you combine it with environment, you're helping them to achieve their agenda. So we have received funding from USAID through Family Health International and Population Reference Bureau. So they do see the links between the environment and the population.
Interesting.
And the danger is if you focus on the risks of wildlife, and there's a fine line of what's a valid risk and what's too much, all of a sudden you create a scare and a backlash potential to that as well. So it's a very fine line conversation.
Sure.
Thank you very much. My name is Dominic from the DRC. And some people believe that we shouldn't treat gorillas in the forest because naturally it lives in the forest that treats some of their illness. And some other people say, no, we have to treat them, because from that we can also know how humans are affected by these diseases. So I don't know if our panelists have ideas or suggestions about that. Thank you.
I think it's a controversial issue, and I know that people have been very, very critical on it, but I think, as I expressed, we don't treat for each case. Let's say if a gorilla has been fighting and has been really in a bad shape, the vet will be not up in the field and treating. We only treat, and this is policy, the guidelines that we have given, and it's among the whole people working with great apes, especially mountain gorilla. We only treat when it's human life and human from human origin, or if life-threatening. We are not, you're not ignorant about the fact that the mountain gorilla and the gorilla are critical in danger for the mountain gorilla. The gorilla, the lowland gorilla still also have a status of protection. So, and it's only on those kind of situations that really people can intervene. The case, for example, of Ebola, and again, I don't know if my colleague can say something about that. This is a life-threatening situation.
To treat a gorilla or not to treat a gorilla?
Yeah.
It depends on who you're talking to. I guess we need to also not get so emotional. Like when you see a gorilla, I think the hardest one is when a gorilla has a wound, a very big wound, and you know that the wound was created out of fighting, and you know that there's the other argument of it may be time for somebody else to take over the group, and so when you intervene, you're interfering with natural selection, and those are the really hard ones for veterinarians. The ones that it's a bit of a gray line because it's life-threatening, but you know that it wasn't created by human beings. But of course, things which are so obvious are like snares. We had rectal prolapse in a gorilla, and I believe that came from a human-related parasite. We treated the gorilla, she got better. So it's a gray line all the time. I think, Dominic, you talked also about invasive sampling. Because actually, if you're doing good medicine, you're supposed to do some invasive sampling to know what they normally carry. But it's still, I think if you talk to biologists, maybe Liz Murphy might say something here, but you really shouldn't, vets are considered sometimes to be trigger happy. They want to treat everything that's sick and dart everything that's sick. And yet, really, you shouldn't be interfering too much with nature. And so it's finding the right balance with a species which is so endangered, like the mountain gorilla, can be quite hard. I think it's still debatable. It's still a debate.
And that's why I wanted to. I think it's a policy question, and it's bigger than the health people question. And I think it's something that each group, each site, country, whatever unit you want to use, needs to have that policy and know what they think. Because the one thing we can tell you is that if you decide to do something, if you're not prepared and you don't have contingency plans, you don't have things available, you won't be able to help and it will be too late. So the contingency planning based on the policies and the philosophies are really important for that. And there are some places that are very prepared and have had those discussions, and there's others where we're still a bit in the analysis paralysis phase.
I have a question for Josephine. I was just wondering, I was struck by when you said how high that proportion of rural communities are relying on bushmeat for the vast majority of their protein. And so what I'm wondering is public health education along the lines of what you presented really feasible for when you're essentially telling people, here's this source of protein that's really important for you, but you shouldn't eat it. How do you kind of work around that issue?
I think it's difficult. I think like I would be looking at it from the ape-specific point of view. So I see that, you know, bushmeat is a very important food source for many people, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So I think that's why my focus is on apes, because I think we certainly can't and possibly, you know, shouldn't even be telling people that they just shouldn't be eating bushmeat at all, especially if there's no affordable alternatives for them. But I think in the sense of the situation that the apes are in, and as I mentioned, there are species that are more robust, and there are a few studies that have shown that some species do actually kind of resist very well to hunting, and that there's even been sort of competitive release where certain more vulnerable species have either become very endangered or gone extinct, and then other species have kind of completely exploded because of the niche left. So I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but it seems like there are certain species that could, you know, be hunted more sustainably than apes, which is why I think if there's just a behaviour change focus on apes, then I do think there is potential for that, particularly if you can find a way to do it where there's an incentive for people. And so that's why I talk about this kind of flip side of, you know, educating them about the disease risk. Like, I think people are much more likely to change their behaviour if they see a positive in it for them, rather than just, you know, doing it because they're told that it's good to do it.
Ask a follow-up?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so I have a short story for my follow-up. So in 2000, when I was a brand new wildlife veterinary type guy, I joined the Bushmeat Crisis Task Force listserv discussion. And the discussion was about disease and health and apes and conservation. And I very naively, without sticking my toe in the water, but just jumping in, said, well, what about using case studies of Ebola potential? And this is before a lot of that happened. And communicating with people about that and telling them the risks. And then maybe they won't have the pets and they, you know, do things like that. And this community, part of in this room, hammered me incredibly hard, to the point where Heather Eves actually called me and said, I'm sorry, and things like that. And it was very interesting. So now you're suggesting, let's go out and talk to people about these risks. And is the world a different place now? Have you gotten a lot of feedback on that kind of suggestion or not? Because the big thing was that people thought, you know, there'd be, if you said, oh, Ebola apes, there's that backlash and they'll go kill all the apes. Valid concerns. Have you evaluated any of that, talked about that, learned anything?
No, I mean,
I'm not going there again, so.
I'm still kind of in the infancy of looking into that at the moment. I'm going out to do a kind of scoping mission in one area.
Heads up on the BCTF listserv, if that still exists, don't talk about this on that.
Good to know.
Very
Good to
frightening.
know.
Do we even just to add on to that, we are part of the National Task Force in Uganda for disease, and Uganda Wildlife Authority is also a part. Maybe Dr. Seguya will get a chance to say something. But definitely from the public health perspective, there's AFINET, African Food Epidemiology Network, CDC, FAO, WHO. They're really pushing the whole angle. So is Respond. They're pushing the whole angle of telling people, whenever there's an Ebola outbreak, did you eat something strange? You know, did anyone eat meat from a strange source? Even with the education that we do around the park, we're like, don't eat this, don't eat that. So I think it's becoming more acceptable. So at least from the public health angle, they're telling people don't eat meat from an unknown source because you die of Ebola. And sometimes the panic works, sometimes it makes things worse, sometimes it makes things better. That's a scary thing.
Thank you. I wonder if we could introduce the discussion about habituation, because the examples we have on the panel of Uganda and Rwanda, where a large proportion of the population of gorillas and a lesser proportion of chimpanzees are habituated, and the health monitoring and treatment is your patients don't run away from you. But across most of Africa, apes are terrified of humans because of the bushmeat hunting, and so you're dealing with, your health monitoring is looking at corpses, either in bushmeat markets or died of unknown causes in the forest, and you don't know whether it's Ebola or anything else. And it's a very different situation. So there is a great discussion about whether habituation is a good or a bad thing. It enables ecotourism, it enables research, it enables close monitoring and health interventions, which save lives and do lots of good things and are the basis of ape conservation in the East. But in Central Africa and West Africa, there's very little habituation, and most of the apes are terrified for very good reason. You wouldn't want to habituate them, but that makes the health monitoring that much harder. So do you have any thoughts on that, on this? Should we habituate for the good things but risk the bad things, or?
I think it's been clear now, and I think even in the past, that when the decision to habituate gorilla was made, it was not really on a consensus. People who are for, people who are really against. And we knew that if, of course, we habituate, great apes, in this case, for example, gorilla, to human presence, there was a risk of disease transmission. But on the other hand, today, there is some observation that, for example, when you see every year the number of newborn baby, it's very surprising to see how those gorillas who have been habituated have more new baby. I'm not directly concluding that it's because of the habituation, but this is an observation. So the worry to talk about if you habituate gorilla, they'll be exposed to human diseases and they can die for. I don't think that it's the same position that many of the people who 30 years ago had. And again, in Rwanda, for example, we have what we call the gorilla naming ceremony, who's been put now in Kinyarwanda as Kwitizina. It's a big it's a big opportunity where we try to put together people coming from the international community, the local people, the local authorities, the communities. Try to show the work that have been doing by our trackers and guide, how the work have been helping their livelihood, because tourism now has been the first, for example, income generation money in terms of foreign money in an economy of the country. And you can see even some replication in the community. So the people now are more willing to be with the park manager to protect the gorillas, to protect the people. And they are more and more aware about the risk that we can be toward the gorillas. So I think, for me, talking on on a mountain gorilla conservation, habituation was a good thing, but I think that we need to be very careful and try to be a kind of very, very strict on the guidelines that we have put. We have some regulation, but I need to confess that those regulations are not really respected during the visit. So we need to be very careful on those regulations to try to reinforce them, but in the other way, and the other hand, to try also to not really habituate too much group, because that's another. It should be another threat for the gorillas.
Dominic, can you address the other side of that, which is, are we getting a skewed picture of disease emergence by only looking at these habituated groups?
So, yeah, the reason we started working in Gombe, well, there are two reasons. One is because of the perceived threat of diseases coming from humans, and people wanted to start a project. And secondly, those of us epi-wise were interested because Gombe was the perfect laboratory, living laboratory, the smallest, kind of tightest, most known population for the longest time. And if you can't do it there, good epidemiological monitoring and things, then the discussion of how to do it in West Africa is blown open in terms of we just need new methods. So I think if we look at this on a gradient level, there are things we can do everywhere, and whether we should or not, I'm biased, but I think there are things we can and should do everywhere. I think there are some places where you can do it intensively and really much more scientifically, and even that, it's hard. I mean, a lot of our stuff is not that good, some is. But we did change the picture of evolution of HIV without touching a chimp in terms of this pathogenic HIV thing. So that was a success story. I think there's success stories in West Africa when you look at the modeling that's been done and a lot of the things around Ebola and some of the publications that have started to come out where you didn't know the populations, but you did do the carcass surveying, and people went and then modeled the results of that. I think it's more sophisticated, there's more uncertainty, but it can be done, and there's, I think, reasons to do that. So there's this gradient, and I think a lot of our goal is to take these things and in places where you can really work out the methodology and then see how far you can push it in terms of usefulness across that gradient. So I think that's a wonderful conversation to have and to continue to have, and many of us are interested in kind of meta-analysis across these sites for that very reason as well, is what methods work better where, and how far can you go with it.
I just wanted to ask, it seems like a lot of discussion around disease and zoonoses and even bushmeat seems to be centered on the African species. And I was wondering, is this not as much of an impact on the Asian apes, the orangutans and the gibbons and the siamangs?
Do you have any insights to that, Antoine? You've worked a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know very much about it, but except what I've read, on cases of those captive who have been put in the reintroduction center, and there's been documentation of tuberculosis in orangutan.
Does anyone else in the room have any expertise in that area who could maybe shed some light on this issue?
Thanks. I was going to ask that question, but I realize I'll be accused of hogging these talks if I talk. But Birite just last week mentioned that there's not a single documented case of disease transmission from a rehabilitant orangutan to a wild population. May be true, but there's not a single documented case of anybody actually looking for any evidence of that either. I think from a personal point of view, right now, we are much more seriously worried about the landscape level loss of habitat, and we're less worried about the risk of introducing a flu virus or something like that. Now, when we get people in the newspapers talking about the possible Ebola evidence as well, again, I remember that I believe that was just indication of an antibody that could have been developed in relation to some other Ebola-type virus or something. But it's something that, personally, I think we should be monitoring much more proactively. Everybody is doing lots of translocations now, so we're going up and knocking out wild orangutans. They're falling out the tree. We're taking them somewhere else and releasing them within like 24 hours. It's a great opportunity to be collecting samples, blood samples and everything else, tissue samples. But because of the legal system, we're not allowed to. We need to apply for a permit to do that about 3 weeks in advance. And so, yeah, anything that we could come out of this workshop that would actually help facilitate or help lobby the Indonesian government to make that sampling and medical monitoring of wild populations process easier would be a very positive step.
What I can say, and I'm going to give you an example, a very recent example. But I agree totally with you. What we did recently, we had an MOU with WHO and the Minister of Health, and Rwanda want to, to declare or want to screen some, human, of course, and some primates and some vector on the yellow fever. So we have a serobank of all the primates that we have now in Rwanda, and it's really large. So we sample. We didn't sample. We had in our biobank, sample from the baboons, the mountain gorillas, the vervet monkey, the mountain monkey. And what happened, for example, all of them were really negative on the yellow fever, but we found in 8 out of 17 baboons, the Zika virus. And we went and we called for a meeting with our colleague from the human medicine who were working with us. And because, of course, WHO was very interested about that. And, of course, they explained that the Zika virus was discovered the first time in 1948 in Uganda. Then later on, when they went testing, where they have some cases, tested in Central Africa, Congo, and in different places. But when you go, for example, for the symptom, they talk about very general, we have some rash, we have a headache, but it's not, there's no mortalities have been observed. The only very interesting thing that was reported from a French medical doctor, he was sick from the Congo Brazzaville, and he transmitted the disease to the wife, and apparently, according to the publication, it was through sexual transmission. So this is, for example, a case where we didn't have any clue. We don't have any report on cases in the world or in Africa in general, because it's not really our first focus. But I think it's very important, as you say, that we can try to look for and screen for, and really try to do some work on science-based, because we don't know, and we are focusing sometimes in some diseases that are not for big, they are not really for treating, at least from now. But we expect that, for example, with the case that we had in Rwanda, WHO and our Minister of Health will be very willing to help and probably to continue the work that been, because this was only an indication of. That's only a case, for example, what is happening, but we didn't know.
Go ahead, Dominic.
Further point, I think, to consider on the orangutan type situation in cultures. So when we talk about health, we talk about risk of extinction in a lot of ways, right? And that it depends on contact structure. So introduction of something, the wiping out of a group, the extinction, local extinction of a population or of large populations like the Ebola conversation. And when you look at social structure and contact structure and you look at orangutans, is it as big a risk to the population level? They're certainly a risk to individual animals, and as you move things around, that's a really kind of interesting discussion with that. But that's part of, I think, the habitat stuff is so overpowering there, and the disease risk to the population is maybe not quite as evident when you look at their social structure.
Is there like a central repository for information? I mean, several of you have talked about surveillance, but is it sort of siloed research, or are you all kind of pooling your data and letting anyone with sufficient interest see at a glance what is happening in the world?
Yes, yes, and yes. We're siloed and we're sharing.
I think there's a lot of database, there's a lot of data, but there's no coordination. That's what my personal observation. It's really something that we could do. There's an attempt when we have this meeting in Leipzig, and when we create a network on the Great Apes, the GAMU, the Great Apes unit, monitoring unit. But I think we could not, and it was really very well received. We have sites with people, and all the sample was supposed to go to a very specific lab, according to what we want, if it's virology or bacteriology. But we need to have probably, again, money was there, I think, but there's been something that was missing.
Yeah, so Max Planck and Robert Koch got together and invested a lot of money into the Great Ape Health Monitoring Unit. And I think it created a lot of collaboration, a lot of interest, a lot of the community, good discussion. There were a number of grants written to try and do meta evaluation and things. There was some parasitology done and some endocrinology done across, but it could definitely use a lot more help.
One of the things you said could be used for fighting the bushmeat was law enforcement. We have a problem in Uganda because we get lots of people, we suspect it's bushmeat, and we take them to court. The first question the judge asks you is, prove to me that this is buffalo and not cow meat. Can you tell us about the advancements that are there to answer this simple question, short of DNA machine that costs $1 million or something? Because we get lots of this, and you want answers quickly for the judge to convict or not to convict. Thank you.
I can try to answer. That's not really my area of knowledge. But I mean, I think, yeah, in terms of identifying the meat species quickly, then it is my understanding that there are much quicker and cheaper methods for DNA analysis currently that perhaps could be used. Yeah, I think that's perhaps a question for someone with more expertise in identification.
I think people are trying to develop small chips, though, to identify whether something is ape meat or not. That should be usable in the field, but that was not my question, what I was going to ask. I was wondering how people in the panel feel that CITES is involved in either having a positive impact on ease of transferring samples when an outbreak occurs, or hampering it. Is that something that someone can address? I imagine it would be great if samples could be shipped around the world to labs for analyses wherever they are in case of an outbreak very, very quickly, instead of going through a permitting process that might take years.
Yeah. For our case, for example, with the mountain gorilla, talking about the contingency plan, this was really well noted, and there's one of the consensus that came up with, if there is an outbreak, all the three CITES authority of the three park, because the contingency plan is been validated and between DR Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda. And this was very well stressed. If there is an outbreak, the CITES authority should be able to deliver within 48 hours. Yeah, the permit. So that's not a big problem. And the other side, of course, in our logistical plan, we have identified laboratory on a local level, regional, and internationally.
I just have to stop for 1 second because I'm having trouble seeing the hand gestures, but I get the sense that we may be out of time. Okay, so I'm sorry, I could talk with you guys all night, but we do have to let our speakers go, but not without a round of applause. So thank you.